Hello, everyone. I am here today to give you a statement or a review about a book that I just finished that I think you will all really find interesting. I think it's very important. So, the book I'm talking about is Ryan McMaken's Breaking Away, his new book. Um, it's um, it's it's inexpensive. You can even get it for free on the Mises Institute website. I'll put a link in the description. But the topic of the book is secession, and Ryan McMaken is one of the strongest voices that we have in favor of the principle or the act of secession. Secession is one of my really important issues. Political decentralization is, I think, one of the most important things to help reduce the power of the state and its reach, and to give people more choices of places to go if the current state that they're living under does not serve their interests. So, I mean, the thing about it is that, it seems like everybody is talking about secession these days. They'll call it that, or they'll call it national divorce, they'll pick some other euphemism, and they all have opinions about it. But the problem is that most of them are woefully misinformed. Of course, you're always going to have those statist ideologues who what they really want to do is tighten their grip on their fellow man for their own benefit. But, there are plenty of people who argue against secession from a relatively good faith practical perspective. But even those people seem to be in a position of really significant ignorance. And in this case, their ignorance is nobody's bliss. So this new book, Breaking Away, is pretty short. It's only about 200 pages. I think 217 ish. Not counting the index and stuff like that. But in my opinion, it's an extremely potent weapon against this ignorance. There are people who will tell you, and they'll be completely wrong, that there aren't any borders that ever change without a war, or things like national debt or nuclear arms are totally insurmountable obstacles to secession. And they'll say these things, and you'll say, well, that doesn't sound right to me, but you won't have a good example to counter them. And this book contains those examples. So, there are other people. The thing is, there's even people who will claim that secession is a path to absolute poverty for one side or another, right? And that usually depends on where their sympathies lie. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. However, Ryan's scholarship in this book it's not just theoretical examples and explanations of how such things might work. What you get here in this book are modern, real-world examples of secession, both large and small. He talks about areas that gained independence, and he talks about places that moved from one state's jurisdiction to another's. In a conversation where one side of the argument seems to absolutely love to be ignorant about these facts, Ryan's hard data overshadow their trite slogans of togetherness or whatever it is. So the book is based on a series of articles, and it has the advantages and a few of the disadvantages associated with that format. On the plus side, he's very thrifty with his words, and he packs a huge amount of information into a relatively small package. There are certain parts of the book that are laser focused on a specific topic, yet the number of topics or the range of topics is pretty wide. He's written a lot of articles over the past few years on the topic of secession as regards to topic X or topic Y, and those X's and Y's can be pretty far apart. So so throwing all of those into this book, you get a very wide look at secession, the arguments for it, the arguments against it, and examples. On the minus side, there are a couple of places where the transitions are a bit stark, and there are some places where similar examples or data are separated pretty far in the text. Something might be mentioned in chapter 2 and then mentioned again in chapter 8 or something like that, when if it had been written with a more if it had been written as a straight up book, those two things might have been smushed together in some place in the middle. However, on the whole, this book is an extremely valuable contribution to the pro-secession toolbox. If you want to argue for it or against it, you're going to want this book, because if you're arguing for it, this is going to provide you examples to knock out a lot of what the anti-secession people are saying. And if you're anti-secession, you should be aware of the data that stand in opposition to your policy ideas. So The start of the book begins with kind of a clear and persuasive theoretical case in favor of secession. So Ryan makes the case that decentralization is a major factor in improving human liberty, and he has a notion of three chief benefits that decentralization has in the book that are pretty solidly, from a theoretical perspective, they're very solidly written. He provides a variety of well-argued examples that help to solidify the case for his benefits of decentralization. He talks about the value of competition between states for citizens who can move back and forth between jurisdictions depending on which one's more advantageous to them. He gives a broad explanation for different economic states of various regions based on their level of centralization. And he explains what conditions are most amenable to peaceful secession. He contrasts this with the tendency of states to self-aggrandize and grow larger. The ideal state is a big one because the bigger the state is, the more it can crush any opposition, right? To this point, he includes references and points and block quotes from other great thinkers on this topic, including people like Benjamin Constant, Gustave de Molinari, Ludwig von Mises, Murray Rothbard, and there's also a lot of references to actual eminent scholars who've written large studies and monographs on the topic, providing data. So that's all very nice too. There's the 7th chapter, which focuses on plebiscites, which is probably one of the most interesting chapters to those of us who argue in favor of secession. What we get in that 7th chapter is a good number of examples of peaceful separations, and it shows us how a simple electoral tool like a plebiscite can actually successfully crystallize a new nation. There's references in that chapter that look like they're going to be a really good source for even more examples if you really want to argue this seriously. One point that's driven home in a satisfying way talks about how the state sycophant media is totally lacking in principle in this issue. So he talks about this. He talks about the New York Times, and it's quite funny because the New York Times was absolutely against the secession of Slovenia from Yugoslavia. And they were like, the Serbs are Yugoslav champions of national integrity. And then a few years later, the Serbs became the bad guys because they wanted to separate and secede part of Bosnia-Herzegovina. And the funny thing, of course, is that Bosnia-Herzegovina was a country, quote unquote, that had really only existed for a few years at the time, right? The country started out in 1991, and New York Times is like, the eternal borders of Bosnia-Herzegovina are sacred and should never be changed. And it's like, dude, it was 3 years ago, right? It's hilarious. So another valuable point that Ryan talks about is the state's attitude towards secession. And he talks about how the U.S. government, for instance, supports secession whenever it sees a potential political gain, but it treats the same idea as absolute craziness when it might reduce its own power. So, for instance, the U.S. meddles in Africa in favor of secession, and when someone in the U.S. says, well, maybe this state should leave the U.S., that same government is like, no, that's never gonna, we're never gonna have that. That's crazy. Flat denial, right? That secession of some of its components might have some merit. The extremely valuable point here is that, of course, while colonization and subjugation are bad words when you apply them to areas outside of a state's legal borders, when you're looking at inside of the state's legal borders, those very same behaviors are seen as the proper will of the people when, they're done to those within its traditional borders. The idea that certain areas might see themselves as unwilling colonies of the bureaucratic apparatus in Washington, D.C. is treated as radioactive, when really it shouldn't be. There's no reason why the people of Alabama or the people, even a smaller, the people of Harris County, Texas, why their interests are the same as those of bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. So, another thing, Ryan takes the time to address some of these arguments against secession. Some people, for instance, are going to argue that secession along any lines you might choose will result in some people being worse off. But the problem with this argument, and Ryan talks about this, the problem with this argument is that this is not a problem with secession per se. It's a problem with limiting secession, right? The idea that California might leave the U.S. and that the Republicans who remain in Northern California will be worse off is true, but the solution to that is for Northern California to secede from the rest of California. If you actually take the principle of secession to its basis, right? Even Mises was like, yeah, I mean, there's nothing that prevents this principle from making its way all the way down to the level of the individual family. But of course, people are like, well, if it's hard to do it when we're big, then it'll be harder to do it when we're small, and that's actually probably not true, right? Once the state admits that secession is a thing that people can do, it kind of trickles down, and people are like, oh, this is an actual thing that we can do, so that we can self-rule, as opposed to being ruled by people who hold our interests in contempt. Anyway, there's an argument that Ryan talks about by a guy named Roger Bootle, that there are some jurisdictions that might be too small. That's another argument. Bootle is talking about Scotland specifically. But Ryan counters this with an irresistible wave of facts about smaller states. For instance, Scotland, if Scotland separated from the UK, it wouldn't even be a very small country in the grand scheme of things. But he also notes things like, hey, states that have different policies can have defensive confederations. That can be a thing. And, that means that a smaller state doesn't necessarily invite invasion by a larger state. I mean, we see small states living alongside large states in the current world anyway. Let's see what else is in there. There's a really fascinating analysis of relationships between gross domestic product, population, and the ability of state to project military might. So there's an important point that he emphasizes is that a state without enough surplus military power to project its force upon its neighbors or around the world, as is the case with the U.S., for instance, that's a feature, not a bug. We don't want states that are large enough to tell other states halfway around the world what to do. We want states that protect and serve their citizens and don't waste and fritter away their citizens' wealth and lives on hopeless tasks across the world. Let's see. There's another really often repeated line, right? That if the U.S. broke up into two nations along red state, blue state lines, that one side or another would fall into absolute poverty. This is a common refrain on both sides. If you look at the red state side people, they'll say, oh, well, the blue states don't have any manufacturing. They don't have any agriculture. They'll starve without us. Or, at the very least, we'll be able to charge them lots of money for the food and materials that they need to run their economy. And then on the blue state side, those people will note, hey, the red states have a lower GDP per capita. They're often net consumers of federal funds. And there's some nuance to that argument as well, right? That, it's because there's a military base, or it's because old people moved to this state and they paid in while they were living in a blue state and then get paid out while they're in a red state. There's a lot of arguments to be had about here. But the point is that Ryan breaks down both of these arguments in his 12th chapter, and he provides a really nice counterfactual with some solid data. Let's see. There's the latter half of the book, the last, not exactly half, but like the last, 2/5. Ryan talks about a variety of other issues, and he does it succinctly and clearly. He talks about the denuclearization of Ukraine, and he even, has stuff in there about current events and how, maybe the denuclearization was done maybe too hastily or maybe not done right, but it is possible, right? So he talks about that on both sides of the argument. He spends a chapter dispelling myths about immigration in America, and these aren't the kinds of things that you hear about from either of the mainstream parties these days. Actually, that chapter on immigration in early America is quite an eye opener. It's fascinating because what it shows is that there's a what's it called? There's a what's it called? Oh, there's declarant alien voting. Yeah, I had to look up the term. There's a term. There was a thing in the early states called declarant alien voting, where resident aliens would declare their desire to become citizens in the near future, and they would be allowed to vote. Like, this is something that I've never heard of, even from the people that are in favor of unlimited immigration. And so Ryan talks about that. He talks about he provides a detailed thought experiment also that talks about the issue of permanent minorities. He basically comes up with the idea of, well, what if a bunch of Asian countries wanted to form kind of a United States of Asia kind of thing. And he talks about how this group would have this problem, that group would have that problem. I won't go into the detail for the purpose of the review, but it's really fascinating, and it's very important to kind of go through these things step by step and talk about them, and Ryan does. Finally, he provides a detailed analysis of the differences between the U.S. system and the EU system, and how certain parts of each are more amenable to freedom of its people. The thing is that people who talk or write about these topics have a tendency to kind of get on one side and be very proud about whatever side they choose to be on. But Ryan, in this book, is incredibly clear-headed and even-handed, and there's no proud posturing that you hear so often from mainstream partisans. It's just not there, which makes the book really, really a good read, because you're going to be thrown ideas that you haven't heard spoken out in a clear way. So my bottom line, Breaking Away is an extremely valuable addition to the conversation about secession. As you can see, I wrote a bunch of notes in mine because there were a bunch of places where I might need to look back at this again. Whatever minor organizational issues this book might have, they're totally overshadowed by the absolute wealth of data and the really clear, concise arguments that are provided. Considering the length of the book and the fact that the whole thing is actually available for free from the Mises Institute website, like I said, I think I said this before. I'll have links in the description. You should buy a copy, but get the free copy and highlight it or something. I don't know. It should be really read by every proponent of secession. And you should keep a copy near at hand to debunk the ignorance that you're going to get thrown at, that's going to get thrown at you when you try to make these arguments. Because the people that are going to make the arguments against secession don't know what they're talking about. And that's what this book really does a good job of showing. So, with that said, Ryan McMaken, Breaking Away. Even if you don't think secession is a good idea, you should read this book and get a better idea of what the actual facts on the argument are. I have some notes, but anyway. So definitely check this book out. I'll have links in the description. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. And I'll see you later.